The smell of burnt oil and old grease is the only thing that ever truly made sense to me. I was deep under the chassis of my 1970 Ford F-100, my knuckles stained with the honest grime of a Saturday afternoon. In my small garage, the air was thick with the heat of Georgia and the smooth, rhythmic sounds of Al Green playing from a battered radio. I have always preferred the company of machines over people, because a machine does not lie to you. If a transmission is slipping, it tells you through a grind. If the fuel line is clogged, it gasps. As I wrestled with a stubborn bolt, I could not help but think about my son DeAndre. I taught that boy how to hold a wrench before he could even properly hold a pencil. I wanted him to understand that a man is defined by the work of his hands and the strength of his word. But DeAndre always had his eyes on something shinier. He traded the red clay of our home for the glass towers of Beverly Hills, chasing a lifestyle built on credit cards and hollow promises. We had not spoken in 730 days. 2 years of silence is a long time for a father to wonder where he went wrong. I had built skyscrapers that touched the clouds, yet I could not build a bridge back to my own blood. Suddenly, my phone buzzed on the wooden workbench, dancing near a pile of washers. I wiped my hands on a rag and looked at the screen. The name DeAndre flashed like a warning light. My heart hammered against my ribs harder than a loose piston. I answered, and his voice sounded different, polished and thin. He told me he was tired of the fighting. He told me he was about to become a father and wanted his son to know his grandfather. He invited me to a reconciliation dinner at his mansion. I wanted to believe him so badly that I ignored the cold feeling in my gut. I spent the next 3 days in my workshop carving a cradle from solid oak. I polished the wood until it shone like bronze. That cradle was not just furniture, it was a peace treaty. I packed it into the back of my truck and started the long drive carrying 40 years of hope in a wooden box. The mansion sat atop the hill like a cold crown of glass and white marble. It was a monument to the kind of wealth that has no soul. I parked my truck and carried the heavy oak cradle toward the front entrance, my heart heavy with a strange mix of hope and dread. Before I could even reach for the doorbell, the side door flew open. Zora, the housekeeper, who had worked for DeAndre for years, stumbled out into the night. Her eyes were wide with a terror so deep it chilled my blood. She grabbed my forearm with a grip like iron. She told me to run. She whispered that it was a trap and that the police were already on their way. I did not ask questions, because the honesty in her trembling voice was louder than any lie my son had ever told. I dropped into the thick shadows of the hydrangeas just as the silent night was shattered by the roar of engines. 3 black vans screeched to a halt in the driveway. A SWAT team in full tactical gear kicked down the front door with a thunderous crash. From my hiding place in the bushes, I watched the unthinkable happen. DeAndre ran out onto the porch, pointing frantically at the very spot where I was supposed to be sitting. He screamed at the officers that his father was a dangerous drug trafficker. He told them I was armed and that I had hidden a shipment in the wooden cradle. My own flesh and blood was trying to buy his freedom with my life. The pain of his words was sharper than any bullet. I realized I had to move or die. I crawled back to my truck and twisted the ignition. As I slammed the gear into reverse, a police cruiser swung around the corner, its blue and red lights blinding me. The officer blocked the only exit out of the narrow driveway. I had nowhere to go but forward. I shifted into 4-wheel drive and floored the accelerator. I steered the heavy truck over the curb and onto the manicured lawn. I used every bit of my old off-road driving skills to navigate the steep embankment. Dirt flew into the air as I bypassed the blockade by mere inches. I disappeared into the darkness of the canyon roads just as the sirens began to howl behind me. I pulled into the gravel parking lot of a flickering neon motel located 40 miles outside of the city limits. The air in the room smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap disinfectant, a far cry from the lavender-scented hallways of the mansion I had just fled. I set the heavy oak cradle on the stained bedspread, my hands still shaking from the adrenaline of the escape. With a heavy heart, I pressed a hidden release valve on the base of the cradle, a secret compartment I had originally designed to hold extra diapers and baby supplies. The wood groaned as it slid open, but instead of soft blankets, I stared at 4 heavy bricks of crystal meth wrapped in clear plastic. There were exactly 2 kilograms of poison sitting in the foundation of my gift. My son had not just tried to frame me, he had used a symbol of new life to carry the instrument of my destruction. I slumped against the wall, the weight of the betrayal crushing the breath from my lungs. I realized then that my life was worth exactly $5 million to DeAndre, the total value of my life insurance policy. He did not want a father, he wanted a payout to settle his debts. The sound of a heavy motorcycle engine cut through my grief. I peered through the plastic blinds and saw a black SUV skid to a halt. 4 men with thick necks and visible ink stepped out looking like the kind of trouble that does not leave witnesses. They were not cops. They were street-level enforcers, the kind of debt collectors who break bones for fun. I heard them shouting for DeAndre, but they knew I was the one who had his truck. One of them kicked my door, the wood splintering near the hinges. I did not have a gun, but I had 40 years of engineering knowledge. I grabbed a heavy wooden rod from the disassembled cradle and stood to the side of the entrance. When the first man burst in, I shoved the heavy oak dresser across the slick linoleum floor, catching him mid-stride and pinning his legs. The second man swung a chain, but I moved with the precision of a man who knows exactly where the load-bearing points of a room are located. I struck the overhead light fixture with my wooden rod, sending a shower of sparks and darkness into their eyes. While they stumbled in the confusion, I kicked out the rusted screen of the rear ventilation window. A weak point I had identified the second I entered the room. I slipped through the narrow gap and vanished into the shadows of the alleyway, just as they began to fire blindly into the empty room. I drove through the rain for 2 hours, my eyes burning from exhaustion and the stinging salt of betrayal. I found myself heading toward the old neighborhood, a place where the concrete holds memories of a time when loyalty was the only currency we had. I pulled up to a small weathered house owned by Silas, a man I had known for over 40 years. We had shared bread, sweat, and secrets since we were 20 years old. I thought if there was one soul left in this world who would remember the code of the streets, it would be him. I knocked on the door with a rhythmic pattern we had used since we were boys. Silas opened the door, but he did not invite me in. He stood in the doorway, his eyes darting toward a sleek black smartphone sitting on his kitchen table. I saw the guilt written across his face before he even spoke a word. He looked at me, then looked away, mumbling something about how hard the times were and how the pension was not enough to cover his medical bills. My heart sank as I noticed a thick envelope resting near his keys, the kind of envelope that only contains large amounts of untraceable cash. I realized in that moment that DeAndre had been busy. My son had not just targeted me, he had systematically mapped out my history and bought every person I ever called a friend. Silas had been paid $50,000 to send a text message the moment I showed up at his porch. The silence between us was heavier than a tombstone. I backed away, watching him reach for the phone with a trembling hand. This was a double betrayal that cut deeper than the first. I understood then that in this modern game of greed, the old rules of honor were dead. I could no longer trust the ghosts of my past or the people who shared my history. I had to trust the power I had built in the shadows. I returned to my truck and pulled out a clean encrypted device hidden beneath the floorboards. It was time to stop being a victim and start being the architect of their downfall. I reached out to my private security team and activated the silent protocols of ironclad capital. I gave the command to wake up the sleeper accounts and begin the digital siege. If my son wanted to play with fire, I was going to show him exactly how it feels when the entire world starts to burn. I stood in the shadows of the alleyway, staring up at the monolith of steel and glass that served as the headquarters for ironclad capital. Most people saw a skyscraper, but I saw a living, breathing machine that I had designed from the foundation to the spire. I knew that simply walking through the front door was a death sentence. Clarence had sent a coded alert to my emergency device confirming that DeAndre had already attempted to bypass my biometric locks 34 times in the last 12 hours. My son was trying to scrub my existence from the very company I built. Because the digital front door was compromised, I had to use the physical secrets only the architect would know. I dropped into the utility crawlspace beneath the south side of the building. The air was thick with the hum of high-voltage cables and the smell of ozone. I navigated through a narrow maintenance tunnel that was never included in the public blueprints. This was the skeletal system of the structure, a labyrinth of pipes and conduits. I encountered a grid of thermal sensors designed to detect any living heat signature. I did not panic. I had installed the calibration settings for these sensors 20 years ago. I waited for the cooling fans of the main server room to exhaust a massive plume of chilled air. I timed my movements to the exact second using the cold mist to mask my body heat as I rolled past the infrared beams. My old bones ached, but the fire in my chest kept me moving. I climbed the internal ladder of the elevator shaft, bypassing 40 floors of security checkpoints. When I finally forced open the hidden panel in the executive library, I stepped out into the dim light of the penthouse office. Clarence Thorne was sitting at the mahogany desk, his face pale and drawn. He looked up and gasped, his fountain pen slipping from his fingers. He saw a man covered in the grease of an old truck, stained with the blood from a motel brawl and smelling of the sewers. He saw a ghost, but when he looked into my eyes, he did not see a victim. He saw the sharp, cold steel of a man who was ready to dismantle everything he had ever created. I told him to sit down and open the master terminal. I told him that the time for being a father was over and the time for being a predator had begun. I sat before the master terminal in the heart of the server room, the blue light of the monitors reflecting off my tired face. My fingers hovered over the keys like a conductor preparing for a dark symphony. I did not feel like a father in that moment. I felt like a demolition expert preparing to pull the pins on a condemned building. DeAndre had forgotten that I owned the ground he stood on. With a few precise keystrokes, I accessed the primary accounts of Ironclad Capital and began the process of total reclamation. I watched the digital bars of his wealth plummet toward zero. I was not just taking back my money. I was systematically dismantling the structural integrity of his existence. Every credit line, every offshore account, and every luxury allowance tied to his name was severed within 90 seconds. As I dug deeper into the encrypted ledgers of his personal spending, the true ugliness of his life came into focus. DeAndre had not just been living beyond his means, he had been gambling with fire. I discovered a series of high-interest loans from international syndicates that operated in the darkest corners of the global market. He owed exactly $10 million to these organizations. He had used the reputation of my company as collateral for his addiction to high-stakes gambling and his desperate need to maintain a fake image on social media. He was a hollow shell held together by debt and lies. I saw invoices for private jets and diamond watches that were paid for with money meant for our employees' pensions. I felt a cold rage settle in my bones. I decided to accelerate the collapse. I did not just freeze his accounts. I triggered a series of automatic margin calls that would alert his creditors within the hour. I released the hold on his primary residence and signaled to the banks that Ironclad Capital would no longer guarantee his liabilities. The financial storm I created was silent, but deadly. It was a mathematical certainty that his world would be in ruins by sunrise. I looked at Clarence and told him that we were not just punishing a traitor, we were performing a necessary surgery to remove a cancer from our legacy. I hit the final enter key and watched the screen go dark. The foundation of his life was gone, and now the gravity of his choices would do the rest of the work. The glass walls of the Beverly Hills mansion echoed with the jagged sounds of a crumbling empire. DeAndre and Tiana stood in the center of their designer living room, surrounded by furniture that cost more than a suburban house, but their faces were twisted with an ugly, primal fear. A notification had just flashed on their shared tablet, informing them that every single line of credit had been terminated. Minutes later, a courier had arrived at the gate to serve a formal notice of immediate foreclosure. Tiana was screaming, her voice a shrill siren, as she accused DeAndre of ruining her life. She threw a crystal vase against the marble floor, shattering it into 10,000 jagged pieces. DeAndre did not even flinch. He was pacing like a caged animal, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused from a cocktail of expensive pills and sheer desperation. He looked at the woman he married and told her to shut her mouth, his voice dripping with a venom that made her stumble backward. Driven by a delusional need to control the narrative, DeAndre grabbed his phone and mounted it on a tripod. He began a live broadcast to his 500,000 followers, weeping crocodile tears and claiming that his father had returned from the shadows to steal his birthright. But the drugs were clouding his judgment. As the viewers watched in real time, his facade began to crack. He started ranting about the wooden cradle and how he had spent 12 hours carefully packing the meth into the base. He laughed a hollow, chilling laugh as he described how easy it was to manipulate the local SWAT team. In his arrogance and his chemical haze, he forgot he was supposed to be the victim. He openly admitted to the entire world that the trap was his masterpiece. He confessed to every crime I had been accused of his words, captured forever on the digital cloud. The nightmare intensified when the roar of high-performance engines drowned out his rambling. 2 armored SUVs drifted into the driveway, followed closely by 5 police cruisers, with their sirens screaming. The international debt collectors had arrived to claim their $10 million at the exact same moment the authorities came to finish their investigation. A group of men in dark suits stepped out of the SUVs, brandishing automatic weapons with a cold efficiency. The police officers scrambled behind their car doors, shouting for everyone to drop their weapons. It was a Mexican standoff on the front lawn of a $1 million nightmare. DeAndre looked out the window and realized that he was caught between the hammer of the law and the anvil of the underworld. He grabbed a gold-plated pistol from the drawer, his hands shaking so violently that he nearly dropped it. A single nervous finger on a trigger was all that stood between a peaceful arrest and a bloodbath that would leave no survivors. I stepped out from the shadows of a black limousine that had just pulled up behind the line of police cruisers. I did not look like the broken old man who had fled in a rusted truck only hours ago. I was wearing a charcoal suit that cost $5,000, and my posture was as straight as a steel beam. The officers initially tried to block my path, but Clarence Thorne stepped forward with the legal injunctions that proved I was the primary lien holder of the entire estate. I walked past the yellow crime scene tape with the steady rhythm of a man who owned the very air everyone was breathing. I was no longer just a father looking for a lost son. I was the largest creditor in his life, and I had come to collect the final debt. The scene on the porch was chaotic. DeAndre was on his knees with his gold-plated pistol lying on the marble tiles just out of reach. 10 red laser dots from the SWAT snipers danced across his chest and forehead. He was sobbing his face a mask of snot and terror as he looked at the wall of weapons pointed at his heart. When he saw me, his eyes lit up with a pathetic flicker of hope. He began to scream for mercy, begging me to tell the police it was all a misunderstanding. He cried out that he was my only son and that we could fix this with my money. I stood 5 feet away from him, looking down with eyes that felt like blocks of ice. The silence I projected was more powerful than the sirens wailing in the street. I looked him directly in the eye and spoke with a voice that was quiet, but carried the weight of a mountain. I told him that I had built a foundation for him out of solid gold, providing him with every advantage a man could ever need to be great. But I told him that he had chosen to build a castle out of sand, fueled by greed and ego. I watched the realization sink in that his empire was gone. The lead police officer signaled his men to prepare to fire as DeAndre reached instinctively for the gun in a moment of pure panic. I raised my hand and shouted for them to hold their fire. I told the captain that I did not want my son to become a martyr or a memory. I wanted him to live. I wanted him to spend the next 20 years in a concrete cell so he could finally learn the value of the freedom he had so casually betrayed. I watched as they ratcheted the steel handcuffs around his wrists, the clicking sound marking the final closure of a failed structure. The iron gates of the state penitentiary slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the canyons of my soul. DeAndre and Tiana were processed into the system, exchanged their designer silk for orange jumpsuits, and began serving their 15-year sentences for conspiracy and possession. I did not look back as I drove away from the courthouse. My first order of business was to authorize the public auction of the Beverly Hills mansion and every piece of hollow luxury inside its walls. We sold the art, the cars, and the marble statues, generating exactly $12,400,000. I took every cent of that tainted money and returned to the broken streets of the South Side where my own journey had begun 68 years ago. I purchased 3 abandoned city blocks and began the construction of the Reed Vocational Center. We transformed old warehouses into state-of-the-art laboratories where young black men and women could learn the precision of engineering and the discipline of trade. I wanted to build a place where the next generation could learn that a man is defined by his contribution to his community, not the brand of his watch. The most important moment of my reclamation happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I stood in the lobby of the new center, watching the sunlight pour through the tall windows. A young woman named Imani walked through the doors, holding the hand of a small boy. She was the daughter DeAndre had tried to hide from me, a secret he kept because she did not fit his image of perfection. She had my eyes and the same stubborn chin that had carried me through 40 years of struggle. I led her to my private office and revealed the oak cradle. I had spent 20 hours meticulously cleaning every inch of the wood, removing the scent of the streets and the stain of the betrayal. It was now pure strong and ready for its original purpose. I ran my hand over the smooth grain and told Imani that this cradle represented a new beginning built on an old, unbreakable foundation. I told her that our bloodline was no longer defined by the greed of her father, but by the resilience of our ancestors. I handed her the heirloom and felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I had carried for 2 long years. I watched her smile as she rocked the cradle, and I knew that the structure of my life was finally stable. The storm had cleared, the debris had been hauled away, and for the first time in a long time, the blueprint for the future looked beautiful. I am Otis Reed, and I have finally finished the most important build of my career. This journey taught me that in the blueprint of life, integrity is the only load-bearing wall that matters. We often spend our best years building empires for our children, forgetting that wealth without character is a weapon that will eventually turn against us. True legacy isn't measured by the height of the skyscrapers we build or the balance in a bank account, but by the strength of the values we instill in the next generation. Loyalty is earned through sweat and truth, not bought with diamonds. Remember, you can rebuild a house, but a foundation of lies will always crumble under the weight of time. Stand firm in your truth and let your life be the anchor that holds steady against any storm.